The auctioneer's gavel came down at 11:47 in the morning, and nobody in that cold county building understood what they'd just watched happen. Eleanor Whitfield paid $75 for a crumbling lighthouse on the Maine coast. $75. Cash. Counted out in fives and tens. Because that's all she had left, after her family closed every account with her name on it. She didn't know yet that inside the rusted iron walls of that lighthouse was a secret her own grandfather had died protecting. She didn't know a dead man's promise from 92 years ago was about to rewrite everything her family thought they owned. 3 months earlier, they'd told her she wasn't really a Whitfield, not the kind that mattered. They were wrong, and the ocean was about to prove it. If you're watching this from somewhere near the coast tonight, drop it in the comments. I want to know where in the world this story's landing. And if you're new here, stick around, because this one gets stranger the deeper it goes. Hit subscribe if you want more of these. Now let's go back to where it actually started. Eleanor Whitfield was 58 years old the morning her brother had her removed from their mother's funeral reception. Not asked to leave, removed. 2 men from the catering staff, hired for the day, walked her through the side door of the Whitfield house on Beacon Hill, while 60 guests in black dresses and dark suits pretended not to watch. Richard Whitfield stood in the doorway of the drawing room as it happened, 62 years old, 6'1", silver hair combed back with military precision, wearing a navy-tailored suit with gold cufflinks shaped like tiny anchors. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. That was the thing about Richard. He'd learned a long time ago that quiet cruelty traveled further than loud cruelty, in rooms full of people who wanted to look away. "This isn't the time, Eleanor," he said, straightening a cufflink. "You've caused enough of a scene." The scene, as he called it, was Eleanor asking, quietly, at her own mother's memorial, whether the will had actually been finalized before their mother's stroke, or after, because the numbers didn't add up. Eleanor had spent 11 years managing their mother's affairs. Doctor visits, medication schedules, the slow, grinding decline that nobody else in the family had time for, because they were too busy running Whitfield Maritime Holdings, the shipping and logistics company their grandfather had supposedly built from nothing. Supposedly. That word would matter later. It would matter more than anyone in that drawing room could have guessed. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk outside the house she'd grown up in, still wearing her black funeral dress, holding nothing but her purse and her late husband's brass pocket compass on its leather cord around her neck. She was 5'6", slim but sturdy in the way of someone who'd spent a decade lifting an aging parent in and out of chairs. Her hair, salt and pepper, had come loose from its bun. Her hazel eyes were dry. She'd stopped being able to cry around her family years ago. The will, when it was read 2 days later in a downtown law office with too much beige carpet, left Eleanor exactly one item: a storage unit key and a folder of old paperwork her mother had kept in a locked drawer, labeled in faded ink, "Eli's Things." Everything else, the house, the company, $41 million in liquid assets, went to Richard and his 2 adult children. "I'm sure Mother had her reasons," Richard's daughter Caroline said afterward, not quite meeting Eleanor's eyes. Eleanor didn't argue. She'd learned, over 3 decades of being the family's afterthought, that arguing with the Whitfields was like arguing with weather. It didn't listen, and it left you soaked either way. She took the storage unit key and drove 2 hours north to a self-storage facility outside Portland, Maine, where her mother had apparently been paying $42 a month for a 10-by-10 unit for the last 19 years without telling a single member of the family. Inside, under a moth-eaten quilt, Eleanor found her grandfather's things. Eli Whitfield, born 1897, died 1961. The man Richard liked to invoke at company dinners as the visionary founder of Whitfield Maritime, a self-made shipping magnate who'd built an empire from a single tugboat. Except the folder told a different story. There were letters, dozens of them, tied in brittle string, postmarked from a place called Miller's Cove, Maine, between 1930 and 1938. There was a faded photograph of a young man in a heavy wool coat, standing at the base of a lighthouse, one hand on the stone, squinting into the wind. On the back, in pencil, Eli Widow's Point, 1931. Keeper's Cottage. Eli Whitfield hadn't started as a shipping magnate. He'd started as a lighthouse keeper. Eleanor sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit for 2 hours, going through letter after letter, piecing together a version of her grandfather nobody in her family had ever mentioned. A man who'd manned an isolated light station on the Maine coast for 8 years before the family fortune supposedly began. A man who wrote to someone named Thomas again and again about a ship called the Concordia and a debt he intended to keep, no matter what it cost him. One letter, dated March of 1933, stopped her cold. "Whatever comes of this, Thomas, I want you to know I never asked for a reward. What I did that night, any keeper would have done. But if you insist on this arrangement, I'll honor it on one condition. It stays between us, and it stays at the light." Some things shouldn't sit in a bank ledger where men with soft hands can find them. Eleanor read that line 4 times. She didn't know what this arrangement meant yet, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that it was the reason her grandfather's early life had been scrubbed so thoroughly from the family story. Richard's version of the Whitfield legacy started with a tugboat and a loan, not with a lighthouse, not with whatever had happened on a stretch of Maine coastline in the winter of 1932. She drove to Miller's Cove 3 days later, told no one where she was going, because by then there was no one left in her family who'd have asked. Miller's Cove was smaller than she expected. A scatter of grey shingled buildings along a working harbour, red-hulled lobster boats tied up at a weathered dock, gulls wheeling over the bait shacks. It smelled like salt and diesel and something older underneath, something that hadn't changed much since 1932. She found Widow's Point Light, 2 miles outside town, at the end of a gravel road that dead-ended at a rocky bluff. The tower stood 40 feet tall, white paint peeling in long grey strips off old brick, its red iron cap streaked with rust. A stonekeeper's cottage crouched beside it, blue shutters hanging crooked, windows boarded. A hand-painted sign at the property line read, "County Auction, August 14th. The county, it turned out, had taken the property back in a tax dispute years earlier. Nobody wanted it. The lighthouse had been decommissioned since the 1960s, replaced by an automated buoy light half a mile offshore. What remained was a liability: crumbling foundations, no working plumbing, a roof that leaked in 6 places. Eleanor stood at the base of that tower, one hand on the cold stone, exactly where her grandfather had stood in that photograph 93 years earlier, and felt something settle in her chest for the first time since the funeral. She had $412 to her name. She went to the auction anyway. The county building in Rockland was half empty that Wednesday morning. A handful of real estate speculators in golf shirts, a young couple who left after the second lot, and Eleanor, sitting near the back in the same black coat she'd worn to her mother's funeral because it was the warmest thing she owned. When the auctioneer called Lot 14, Widow's Point Light Station, nobody else in the room raised a paddle. "Going once at $50, the auctioneer said, barely looking up. "Going twice." Eleanor's hand went up before she'd fully decided to lift it. $75. The gavel came down almost immediately. Nobody wanted to fight her for a condemned lighthouse with no plumbing on a dead-end road. She signed the paperwork with a shaking hand. County Clerk Marjorie Hutchins, a stout woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, slid the deed across the counter and said, not unkindly, "Hope you know what you're getting into, hun. That place hasn't had a soul living in it since Nixon was president." Eleanor folded the deed into her purse, next to her grandfather's letters, and said, "That's all right. I think I'm looking for something that's been waiting a long time." She had no idea, standing in that clerk's office with $75 gone and 437 miles of complicated family history behind her, that within 6 weeks she would find a hollow space behind the keeper's cottage hearth, a rusted strongbox wrapped in oiled canvas, and a name on a shipping manifest that would make Richard Whitfield's polished, quiet world come apart at every seam he'd spent 30 years sewing shut. For now, all she knew was this. Her grandfather had told her, in ink, from beyond the grave, that some things shouldn't sit in a bank ledger where men with soft hands could find them. Eleanor Whitfield had soft hands once too. Not anymore. She drove out to Widow's Point that same afternoon, parked her 10-year-old sedan at the end of the gravel road, and walked up to the cottage door with the key the clerk had given her, a key that hadn't turned a lock in over half a century. It stuck. Then it gave. The door swung open into 40 years of dust and silence, and Eleanor Whitfield stepped inside the first thing she'd owned outright in her entire adult life. The auctioneer's gavel came down at 11:47 in the morning, and nobody in that cold county building understood what they'd just watched happen. Eleanor Whitfield paid $75 for a crumbling lighthouse on the Maine coast. $75, cash, counted out in 5s and 10s, because that's all she had left after her family closed every account with her name on it. She didn't know yet that inside the rusted iron walls of that lighthouse was a secret her own grandfather had died protecting. She didn't know a dead man's promise from 92 years ago was about to rewrite everything her family thought they owned. 3 months earlier, they'd told her she wasn't really a Whitfield, not the kind that mattered. They were wrong, and the ocean was about to prove it. If you're watching this from somewhere near the coast tonight, drop it in the comments. I want to know where in the world this story's landing. And if you're new here, stick around, because this one gets stranger the deeper it goes. Hit subscribe if you want more of these. Now let's go back to where it actually started. Eleanor Whitfield was 58 years old the morning her brother had her removed from their mother's funeral reception. Not asked to leave, removed. 2 men from the catering staff walked her through the side door of the Whitfield house on Beacon Hill, while 60 guests in black dresses and dark suits pretended not to watch. Richard Whitfield stood in the doorway as it happened, 62 years old, silver hair combed back with military precision, navy suit, gold cufflinks shaped like tiny anchors. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. Quiet cruelty traveled further than loud cruelty, in rooms full of people who wanted to look away. "This isn't the time, Eleanor," he said, straightening a cufflink. "You've caused enough of a scene." The scene was Eleanor asking, quietly, whether the will had actually been finalized before their mother's stroke or after, because the numbers didn't add up. Eleanor had spent 11 years managing their mother's affairs, doctor visits, medication schedules, the slow decline nobody else had time for because they were too busy running Whitfield Maritime Holdings, the shipping company their grandfather had supposedly built from nothing. Supposedly. That word would matter later. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk outside the house she'd grown up in, still in her black funeral dress, holding nothing but her purse and her late husband's brass pocket compass on its leather cord. 5'6", salt and pepper hair coming loose from its bun, hazel eyes dry. She'd stopped being able to cry around her family years ago. The will, read 2 days later in a downtown law office, left Eleanor exactly one item, a storage unit key and a folder labeled, in faded ink, Eli's Things. Everything else, the house, the company, $41 million, went to Richard and his 2 adult children. "I'm sure Mother had her reasons," Richard's daughter Caroline said, not quite meeting her eyes. Eleanor didn't argue. Arguing with the Whitfields was like arguing with weather. She took the key and drove 2 hours north to a storage facility outside Portland, where her mother had been quietly paying rent on a 10 by 10 unit for 19 years without telling a soul. Inside, under a moth-eaten quilt, Eleanor found her grandfather's things. Eli Whitfield, born 1897, died 1961. The man Richard invoked at company dinners as the self-made visionary who'd built an empire from a single tugboat. The folder told a different story. Letters, dozens of them, postmarked from a place called Miller's Cove, Maine, between 1930 and 1938. A faded photograph of a young man in a wool coat at the base of a lighthouse, one hand on the stone. On the back, in pencil, Eli Widow's Point, 1931, Keeper's Cottage. Eli Whitfield hadn't started as a shipping magnate. He'd started as a lighthouse keeper. Eleanor sat on the concrete floor for 2 hours, piecing together a version of her grandfather nobody had ever mentioned. A man who'd manned an isolated light station for 8 years before the family fortune supposedly began. Writing again and again to someone named Thomas about a ship called the Concordia and a debt he intended to keep no matter what it cost him. One letter, dated March 1933, stopped her cold. "Whatever comes of this, Thomas, I want you to know I never asked for a reward. What I did that night, any keeper would have done. But if you insist on this arrangement, I'll honor it on one condition. It stays between us, and it stays at the light. Some things shouldn't sit in a bank ledger where men with soft hands can find them." Eleanor read that line 4 times. She didn't know what this arrangement meant, but she knew, with sudden certainty, that it was the reason her grandfather's early life had been scrubbed from the family story. Richard's version began with a tugboat and a loan. Not a lighthouse, not whatever had happened on that stretch of coastline in the winter of 1932. She drove to Miller's Cove 3 days later, telling no one, because there was no one left to ask. Miller's Cove was small, grey-shingled buildings along a working harbour, red-hulled lobster boats, gulls over the bait shacks. It smelled like salt and diesel and something older underneath. She found Widow's Point Light 2 miles outside town, at the end of a gravel road. The tower stood 40 feet tall, white paint peeling off old brick, red iron cap streaked with rust. A stonekeeper's cottage crouched beside it, blue shutters hanging crooked. A hand-painted sign at the property line read, "County Auction, August 14th. The county had taken the property back in a tax dispute. The lighthouse had been decommissioned since the 1960s, replaced by an automated buoy half a mile offshore. What remained was a liability, crumbling foundations, a roof that leaked in 6 places. Eleanor stood at the base of that tower, one hand on the cold stone, exactly where her grandfather had stood in that photograph 93 years earlier, and felt something settle in her chest for the first time since the funeral. She had $412 to her name. She went to the auction anyway. The county building in Rockland was half empty. A few speculators in golf shirts, a young couple who left after the second lot, and Eleanor in the same black coat she'd worn to her mother's funeral. When the auctioneer called Lot 14, Widow's Point Light Station, nobody else raised a paddle. "Going once at $50, the auctioneer said, barely looking up. "Going twice." Eleanor's hand went up before she'd fully decided to lift it. 75. The gavel came down. Nobody wanted to fight her for a condemned lighthouse with no plumbing on a dead-end road. She signed the paperwork with a shaking hand. County Clerk Marjorie Hutchins, reading glasses on a beaded chain, slid the deed across the counter. "Hope you know what you're getting into, hun. That place hasn't had a soul living in it since Nixon was president." Eleanor folded the deed into her purse next to her grandfather's letters. "That's all right. I think I'm looking for something that's been waiting a long time." She had no idea that within 6 weeks she would find a hollow space behind the keeper's cottage hearth, a rusted strongbox wrapped in oiled canvas, and a name on a shipping manifest that would make Richard Whitfield's polished, quiet world come apart at every seam he'd spent 30 years sewing shut. For now, all she knew was this. Her grandfather had told her, in ink from beyond the grave, that some things shouldn't sit in a bank ledger, where men with soft hands could find them. Eleanor Whitfield had soft hands once too, not anymore. She drove out to Widow's Point that same afternoon, parked at the end of the gravel road, and walked up to the cottage door with a key that hadn't turned a lock in over half a century. It stuck. Then it gave. The door swung open into 40 years of dust and silence, and Eleanor Whitfield stepped inside, the first thing she'd owned outright in her entire adult life. The dust inside the cottage hung thick in the afternoon light, slanting through the one window whose boards had rotted enough to let a strip of sun through. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting her eyes adjust, letting the smell settle into her. Salt, mildew, old wood smoke, gone cold decades ago. A single room downstairs, low-beamed ceiling, a stone hearth on the far wall taller than she was. A rusted iron bed frame in the corner, no mattress. A table with 2 chairs, one missing a leg. Everything coated in the kind of dust that only comes from being forgotten, not just abandoned. She spent the first week just clearing it out, driving into Miller's Cove each morning for coffee and hardware supplies, driving back each evening to sweep, scrub, haul debris to a dumpster she'd rented with money she didn't really have. She slept in her car the first 3 nights, until she got the bed frame steady enough and bought a camping mattress from the general store. The owner of that store was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s named Walter Pruitt, weathered face, grey beard trimmed close, flannel shirt rolled to the elbow. He'd lived in Miller's Cove his whole life, and on her 3rd visit, he set down the mattress on the counter and studied her for a moment. "You're the one bought the light station," he said. "Not a question. I am. Whitfield," he said the name slowly, like he was turning it over. "Any relation to Eli Whitfield kept that light back in the 30s. Eleanor's breath caught. "He was my grandfather." Walter's expression shifted, something between surprise and a kind of quiet recognition. "My father used to talk about him. Said he was the best keeper this coast ever had. Saved the Pearson boys off the rocks in a nor'easter. Must have been 34, 35. Folks around here still tell that story." He paused, rang up the mattress. Then he just left. One winter he was here, next spring he wasn't. Never came back, far as anyone knew. Bit of a mystery, actually. "My father always figured something happened out here that made him go." "What kind of something?" Walter shrugged, but his eyes didn't quite meet hers. "Old talk. Probably nothing. You should ask Agnes Doyle, down at the Historical Society. She's got the old shipping records, keeper's logs, all of it. Woman remembers more about this town than the town remembers about itself." Eleanor thanked him and drove straight there. The Miller's Cove Historical Society occupied a single room above the public library, run by Agnes Doyle, 81 years old, sharp blue eyes behind thick glasses, white hair pinned up with a pencil through it. She listened to Eleanor's story, the will, the storage unit, the letters, the auction, without interrupting once, her expression growing more intent with every detail. "Eli Whitfield," Agnes said finally, standing and moving toward a filing cabinet in the corner. "I wondered if anyone would ever come asking about him again." She pulled out a thin folder, yellowed newspaper clippings inside, and laid them on the table. The first was a Portland newspaper from February 1932. The headline read, "Lighthouse Keeper Rescues Crew of Foundering Freighter in Storm." Below it, a grainy photograph of a young man wrapped in an oilskin coat, standing on a rocky shore beside a group of exhausted-looking sailors wrapped in blankets. "That's the Concordia," Agnes said, tapping the photo. "Cargo freighter, ran into trouble in a February gale, nearly broke apart on the rocks below Widow's Point. Your grandfather went out in a dory in the middle of the storm and pulled 4 men off her before she went down. The captain, a man named Thomas Ashford, survived because of Eli. So did the ship's cargo manifest, which your grandfather apparently swam back out to retrieve after the crew was safe. Eleanor's pulse quickened.
Thomas! That's the name in the letters. Thomas Ashford, Agnes confirmed. He wasn't just any freighter captain. Ashford Shipping Company, out of Boston. Fairly wealthy family, before the Depression hit them hard, like it hit everyone. But here's the part most people don't know. Agnes leaned forward. The Concordia wasn't just carrying general freight that night. According to the insurance claim filed afterward, which I have a copy of, because the Historical Society ended up with half the county's old maritime records when the courthouse flooded in '78, she was also carrying a private consignment. Gold specie. Coin, not bullion. Ashford was moving family assets out of Boston ahead of a bank failure he saw coming. Smart man, in that sense. Poor timing, given the storm. Gold, Eleanor repeated. Most of the crates went down with the ship, from what the claim says. Salvage crews recovered some of it over the following years, when the weather allowed dives. But the official record always noted a discrepancy. The manifest Eli saved didn't match the amount insurance eventually paid out on. Some of it was never accounted for. Agnes sat back, studying Eleanor over her glasses. There was talk, back then, that Ashford paid your grandfather something for his trouble, more than a reward for pulling men out of the water. Nobody knew how much, or in what form. Eli never confirmed it, and he left Miller's Cove for good less than a year after the wreck. Eleanor thought of the letter in her folder. It stays between us, and it stays at the light. Do you know anything about a strongbox? She asked. Or where in the cottage he might have kept something? Agnes shook her head slowly. That I don't know. But if I were you, I'd start with the hearth. Keepers back then built false compartments into those old stone fireplaces all the time. Dry storage, away from the damp, hidden from anyone passing through when the keeper wasn't home. It was common enough that nobody thought twice about it. Eleanor drove back to Widow's Point that evening, with her heart going harder than it had in years. She worked at the hearth for 3 days before she found anything, chiseling carefully at the mortar between stones on the inner wall, wary of damaging whatever might be behind it. Her hands blistered. Her knees ached on the stone floor. Twice she nearly gave up, telling herself Agnes's theory was just an old woman's guess, that she was chasing a story that existed only in her own need for one. On the 4th day, a stone shifted under her chisel that hadn't shifted before. She worked her fingers into the gap and felt cold metal. It took another hour to widen the opening enough to pull it free. A strongbox, iron, roughly the size of a bread loaf, wrapped in oiled canvas gone stiff and dark with age. The canvas had protected it well enough that the box beneath, though rusted at the hinges, was largely intact. Eleanor sat on the floor of the cottage, with it in her lap for a long time, before she opened it. Inside, wrapped in more oilcloth, she found 11 gold coins. Heavy, dulled with age, but unmistakably gold, each stamped with an eagle and a date, 1928, 1929, 1930. Beneath the coins, a folded letter, the paper brittle, but the ink still legible, signed Thomas Ashford. And beneath that, a shipping manifest, the original from the Concordia, listing a consignment of gold specie far larger than 11 coins. A consignment that, according to what Agnes had told her, official records claimed had gone down entirely with the ship. Eleanor read Thomas Ashford's letter 3 times by the light of a battery lantern, her hands shaking so badly she had to set it down twice. It confirmed everything and opened up something far bigger. Ashford hadn't just paid Eli Whitfield 11 coins for saving his life. He'd made him a partner, quietly, permanently, in a set of maritime insurance claims and salvage rights tied to the Concordia and 2 other Ashford vessels, an arrangement structured, the letter explained,
specifically so it would never have to touch the Whitfield name in any bank ledger, exactly as Eli had asked.
Ashford had set it up through a private holding entity instead, a holding entity that, as far as Eleanor could tell from the letter's language, might never have been formally dissolved. She thought of Richard, standing in his doorway in his navy suit, invoking their grandfather's genius at company dinners. Self-made. A tugboat, and nothing else. He had no idea what he didn't know. Eleanor sat in the dark of the cottage her grandfather had once called home, 11 gold coins in her lap, and a letter that suggested there was far more where they came from. And for the first time since her mother's funeral, she didn't feel like the family's afterthought. She felt like the only Whitfield who actually understood what they'd built. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She sat at the wobbly table with the lantern burning low, the strongbox open in front of her, reading Thomas Ashford's letter again and again until she'd nearly memorized it. Certain phrases kept snagging in her mind. A private holding entity, established under the name Cormorant Trust, for the purpose of managing salvage and insurance proceeds tied to the Concordia and her sister vessels. Half interest, in perpetuity, held in trust for Eli Whitfield and his lawful heirs. Never to be recorded under the Ashford or Whitfield names directly, per Mr. Whitfield's expressed wish for discretion. Cormorant Trust. She said it out loud once, just to hear how it sounded, and something about it settled into her chest like a stone dropping into still water. If that trust had never been dissolved, if it still existed, buried somewhere in 90 years of paperwork, then whatever assets it held weren't part of her mother's estate. They weren't part of Whitfield Maritime Holdings. They weren't Richard's, or Caroline's, or anyone's but the legal heirs of Eli Whitfield. Which, as far as Eleanor knew, standing in that cottage at 2 in the morning, was just her. She drove into Miller's Cove the next day and sat across from Agnes Doyle again, laying the letter, the manifest, and the 11 coins out on the Historical Society's table, like evidence in a trial only Eleanor understood the stakes of. Agnes read the letter twice, her sharp blue eyes tracking every line, and when she finally looked up, her expression had changed. Less curiosity now, something closer to caution. "You need a lawyer," Agnes said. "Not a local one who does wills and property closings. Someone who understands maritime insurance law and old trust instruments." "This isn't a treasure hunt anymore, dear. This is a legal claim, and if there's real money attached to it, you can be certain that if word gets out, people will come looking to complicate your ownership of it. I don't have money for a lawyer like that." Agnes was quiet for a moment, drumming her fingers on the table. "There's a man in Portland, Daniel Reyes. Used to be maritime counsel for one of the big insurance underwriters before he went independent. He helped the Historical Society untangle a dispute over a shipwreck salvage claim a few years back, pro bono, because he found it interesting. He's the kind of man who likes puzzles more than money. I'll call him." Daniel Reyes turned out to be somewhere in his 50s, compact and precise, wire-rimmed glasses, a small office above a bookshop with nautical charts pinned to every wall. He listened to Eleanor's story without interrupting, examined the letter and manifest under a jeweler's loupe, and didn't say much until he'd finished. "This is real," he said finally. "The letterhead, the language, the dating. This is consistent with genuine 1930s trust instruments, and Ashford Shipping was a real entity, well documented. If Cormorant Trust was properly established and never formally dissolved, and if you can establish direct lineage from Eli Whitfield as his lawful heir, you may have a legitimate claim to whatever assets remain under it." He set the loop down. "The question is what those assets actually are today and where they're sitting. 90-some years is a long time for a trust to just sit dormant without anyone noticing. Can you find out?" "I can try. It'll take time, and it'll take some money for filing fees and record searches, even if I don't charge you for my hours."
He studied her for a moment. "Mrs. Whitfield, can I ask, does your family know you're doing this?"
Eleanor thought about Richard's face in the doorway. "This isn't the time, Eleanor. You've caused enough of a scene." "No," she said, "and I'd like to keep it that way for now." Daniel nodded slowly, like that answer told him something useful. "Understood. I'll start quietly. Corporate registries, probate archives, insurance underwriter records from the period. These things do occasionally still exist, especially if the trust held real property or securities that generated ongoing paperwork. Tax filings, however minimal, tend to leave a trail even when everyone's forgotten why." It took him 11 days. Eleanor spent them at Widow's Point, splitting her time between restoring the cottage and standing at the base of the lighthouse tower at dusk, looking out at the water her grandfather had once rowed into during a storm to save 4 strangers' lives. She replaced boards, scrubbed rust, cleared the spiral stairs inside the tower of 8 decades of gull nests and debris. Walter Pruitt stopped by twice, with tools she hadn't asked for and wouldn't take payment for. Agnes brought her a thermos of coffee and old photographs of the light station in its working years, the beam still turning, a keeper's silhouette visible in the lantern room window. Slowly, without entirely meaning to, Eleanor was rebuilding the one thing in her life nobody could take a vote and strip away from her. Daniel called on a Tuesday evening, and Eleanor could hear something in his voice before he'd said more than her name. "I found it," he said. Cormorant Trust was incorporated in Massachusetts in 1933, and it was never formally dissolved. It went dormant for decades, no activity, no filings, which usually means an asset like that just gets quietly absorbed or forgotten. But it wasn't absorbed, Eleanor. In 1958, a small portion of the trust's holdings were converted into shares of a company going through early-stage incorporation, a logistics company. Started with a single tugboat. Eleanor felt the floor tilt slightly under her, even though she was sitting down. "Whitfield Maritime," she said. "Whitfield Maritime," Daniel confirmed. Eli Whitfield used a portion of the trust's assets, his portion. The portion that was legally his under the 1932 agreement with Ashford, to seed his own shipping company. That's your family's founding capital, Eleanor. Not personal savings, not a bank loan, like your brothers always claimed. Trust assets that, under the original 1933 instrument, were designated specifically for Eli and his lawful heirs, held separately from any subsequent corporate structure he built on top of them. So the company itself? The company is a separate question, and given 90 years of corporate restructuring, that'll be complicated to untangle, if it's even worth untangling. But here's what matters right now. Daniel paused, and she could hear paper shuffling on his end. Not all of the trust's assets were converted in 1958. Roughly 40% remained in the original trust structure, invested conservatively over the decades by a Boston fiduciary firm that still exists, still administers a handful of these old dormant instruments as a specialty service. That 40% has been sitting there, compounding, largely untouched, because nobody with legal standing ever came forward to claim it or dissolve it. "How much, Daniel?" He told her the number. Eleanor had to ask him to repeat it, because the first time she was certain she'd misheard. She hadn't. $6.3 million. Sitting in a 92-year-old trust, established by a grateful shipping magnate for the lighthouse keeper who'd swum back into a sinking ship to save his life and his cargo manifest, waiting for exactly one thing: a lawful heir of Eli Whitfield, willing to step forward and claim it. Eleanor sat in the dark of the cottage, the lantern flickering, the 11 gold coins still spread across the table where she'd left them that morning, and for a long moment she didn't say anything at all. Then she thought of Richard's cufflinks, shaped like tiny anchors, of Caroline not quite meeting her eyes, of 30 years of being the family's afterthought,
the sister nobody had time for, the daughter who did the actual work of caring for their mother while everyone else collected the credit. "What do I need to do," she said finally, "to make this real?" "Establish lineage first," Daniel said. "Birth certificate, your mother's birth certificate linking her to Eli, and yours linking you to her. Standard probate documentation, nothing exotic. Once that's filed with the Massachusetts court and the fiduciary firm, they'll have no legal basis to refuse your claim. I'd estimate 60 to 90 days for the paperwork to clear, assuming no one contests it." "Would anyone have grounds to contest it?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Not grounds exactly, but if your brother's company has spent 90 years telling the story that Eli built it from nothing, and it turns out that story isn't true, that the founding capital came from a trust legally reserved for lawful heirs, a trust your brother apparently never knew existed, he may not take that news well. People rarely enjoy hearing their entire origin story was, at best, incomplete." Eleanor looked around the cottage. The swept floor, the mended window, the hearth with its stone still pulled slightly loose from where she'd worked it free. "He's about to find out anyway," she said. "Might as well be from me." The paperwork took 41 days, not 60 to 90, because Daniel Reyes turned out to be more efficient than either of them had expected, and because Eleanor, once she'd set her mind to something, worked it the way she'd worked 11 years of her mother's care, without complaint, without rest, until it was done. She drove to 3 different town halls to pull certified copies of birth certificates. She found her mother's original birth record in a courthouse basement in Bangor, water-stained but legible, listing Eleanor Grace Whitfield's mother as the daughter of Eli Whitfield and Margaret Whitfield, born 1934. She found her own birth certificate in a filing cabinet the county clerk had to unlock with a key that hadn't been used in years. Daniel assembled it all into a single probate filing and submitted it to the Massachusetts court, along with a formal claim letter to Coastal Fiduciary Partners, the Boston firm that had quietly administered the dormant trust for 9 decades. The response came back faster than either of them expected, too. 11 days after filing, a letter arrived at Daniel's office confirming receipt of the claim, requesting a follow-up meeting, and noting, almost as an afterthought at the bottom of the second page, that Coastal Fiduciary Partners would need to notify all parties with a potential interest in the trust's history before disbursement could proceed. "What does that mean?" Eleanor asked, sitting across from Daniel's desk. "All parties with a potential interest." Daniel took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "It means that somewhere in their compliance process, they're going to do a record search connecting Cormorant Trust to its 1958 conversion into Whitfield Maritime founding shares. And when they do that, they're going to find your brother's company, and they're going to send a courtesy notification to whoever's listed as the current registered agent." Richard, Daniel confirmed. "It's not a legal requirement that could block your claim. The trust assets you're pursuing are the 40% that were never converted, entirely separate from the company itself. But it does mean he's about to find out you filed this, likely before you're ready to tell him yourself." Eleanor had known, on some level, that this moment was coming. She just hadn't expected it to arrive on a Thursday, in the form of Richard Whitfield's black Mercedes pulling up the gravel road to Widow's Point at 7 in the evening while she was up on a ladder replacing a section of the cottage's rain gutter. She climbed down slowly, wiping her hands on her jeans, and watched her brother get out of the car in a charcoal suit that had clearly come straight from an office, his silver hair less perfectly combed than she'd ever seen it, a folder clutched in one hand like a weapon. "What is this?" Richard said, holding up the folder as he crossed the gravel. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the lighthouse behind her, or the 2 months of work visible in the freshly painted trim and the cleared brush. "I got a call today from a fiduciary firm in Boston, asking me to confirm the corporate history of Whitfield Maritime for something called Cormorant Trust.
Do you have any idea what that is?
I do, Eleanor said. I found it. Something flickered across Richard's face. Not quite fear, not yet, but the first edge of it. Found what, Eleanor? Explain this to me like I'm not standing in front of a lighthouse you apparently live in now, she told him.
All of it. The storage unit, the letters, the drive to Miller's Cove, the auction, the strongbox behind the hearth, Thomas Ashford and the Concordia, and the 11 gold coins, and the trust their grandfather had structured so quietly it had survived undiscovered for 92 years. She kept her voice level the entire time, the way she'd learned to during 11 years of doctor's appointments and difficult conversations with a mother who didn't always want to hear the truth either. Richard listened with his jaw tightening by degrees, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking past her at the tower, its white paint fresh where she'd repainted the lower third, its old iron cap catching the last of the evening light. "This is absurd," he said finally, but his voice had lost some of its usual certainty. "Grandfather built that company from a tugboat. Everyone knows that. It's in every profile the company's ever published. It's on the wall of the corporate office." "It's not true, Richard. I have the letter from Thomas Ashford himself. I have the original manifest. I have the trust documents, filed and certified. Coastal Fiduciary Partners has been quietly managing this for decades. This isn't a theory I'm testing on you. It's already gone through probate court. And you didn't think to call me first. Your own brother." Eleanor felt something in her chest that had been coiled tight for months finally come loose. Not into anger exactly, but into something colder and steadier than anger. "You had 2 men walk me out of our mother's funeral," she said. "You gave me a storage unit key and called it fair. You've spent 30 years letting me do the work nobody else wanted and taking the credit for the parts that mattered. So no, Richard, I didn't think to call you first. I thought about it actually, and I decided you'd had enough first calls." Richard's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in Eleanor's memory, her brother had nothing polished to say. "This isn't going to change what's yours," he said finally, quieter now, some of the bluster gone out of it. "The company is mine. Mother's estate is settled, whatever this trust is. I'm not after the company, Richard. I never was. I'm claiming what was legally set aside for Eli Whitfield's heirs 92 years ago, sitting in an account that has nothing to do with you or Whitfield Maritime's operations today. You'll keep your company. You'll keep your house, your cufflinks, all of it." She paused. "But you don't get to keep pretending grandfather built this alone out of nothing, because he didn't. He built it because a man he pulled out of a sinking ship in a February storm wanted to make sure he never had to struggle again. And instead of that gift going to the people it was actually meant for, it got folded into a company that then wrote me out of its story entirely." Richard stood there for a long moment on the gravel, the wind off the water pulling at his suit jacket, looking somehow smaller than he had in his mother's drawing room 3 months earlier. "I need to talk to our lawyers," he said finally, which was as close to a retreat as Eleanor had ever heard from him. "You do that?" she said. "Mine already have everything filed." He got back in the car without another word. Eleanor watched the taillights disappear down the gravel road toward the highway, and then she turned back to the ladder, the half-finished gutter, the tower rising white and patient against the darkening sky behind her. She climbed back up and kept working, because the light needed fixing whether her brother approved of her or not. And for the first time, in longer than she could remember, that felt like the only opinion that mattered. The disbursement hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late October, in a Suffolk County probate courtroom that smelled like old radiator heat and floor polish. Eleanor sat at a long table beside Daniel Reyes, wearing a grey wool coat she'd bought second-hand in Miller's Cove, because it felt more honest than anything still hanging in her closet from her old life. Across the aisle, Richard sat with 2 lawyers in suits that cost more than Eleanor's lighthouse, his face arranged into the same careful neutrality he wore at company dinners. He hadn't contested the claim outright. His lawyers had tried, in the weeks between his visit to Widow's Point and this hearing, to argue that any trust assets tracing back to Eli Whitfield's founding capital were functionally inseparable from Whitfield Maritime's corporate history, and therefore subject to the same estate settlement that had already been finalized. Daniel had spent 3 weeks systematically dismantling that argument with bank records, the original 1933 trust instrument, and the 1958 conversion paperwork showing exactly which assets had gone into the company and which 40% had been deliberately, formally kept separate. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Constance Abernathy, with a voice like gravel and no patience for theatrics, had read through both filings twice before the hearing and made her position clear within the first 20 minutes. "Mr. Whitfield's counsel," she said, looking over her glasses at Richard's lawyers, "you're asking me to fold a legally distinct trust instrument into a corporate estate settlement. It was specifically excluded from 92 years ago. I've read the 1933 document." Eli Whitfield was explicit. "This isn't ambiguous language I need to interpret generously in your client's favor. It's a clearly drafted trust for his lawful heirs, separate from any business he later chose to build." By 11 that morning, it was over. Judge Abernathy signed the disbursement order releasing the trust's assets to Eleanor Whitfield as Eli Whitfield's sole surviving direct heir with legal standing to claim, minus decades of modest management fees Coastal Fiduciary Partners had quietly deducted along the way. The final number, after fees and accrued interest calculated to the day, came to just over $6.1 million. Eleanor sat very still when the judge read the order aloud, her hands folded in her lap, and didn't fully feel it until she was out on the courthouse steps afterward, the cold October air sharp in her lungs, Daniel beside her with a folder of certified documents under his arm. "You did it," he said, and for a man who dealt in maritime insurance law and dusty trust instruments, he sounded genuinely moved. "We did it," Eleanor said. Richard came down the steps a few minutes later, alone, his lawyers having peeled off toward a waiting car. He stopped a few feet from her, hands in his coat pockets, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. "Congratulations," he said finally, and it came out stiff, but not entirely insincere. "Thank you. I looked into it more," he said. "After I calmed down enough to actually read what your lawyer sent over, instead of just reacting to it. Grandfather really did keep it quiet his whole life. Never told anyone, not his own children apparently, since Mother clearly didn't know either, or she'd have said something before she—" He stopped, jaw working. "She kept your storage unit a secret from all of us too. 19 years of storage fees. I keep wondering why." Eleanor had wondered the same thing, more than once, in the weeks since the hearing had been scheduled. "I think she knew," she said slowly. "Not everything, but something. I think she kept it because she didn't know what else to do with it, and she left it to me because some part of her knew I'd actually go looking, instead of just filing it away like everyone else in this family does with things that are inconvenient." Richard flinched slightly at that, but didn't argue. "The company's origin story," he said instead. "The one on the wall in the lobby. The tugboat. The self-made man. We're going to have to change it, aren't we?" "That's up to you," Eleanor said. "I'm not asking you to. I meant what I said at the lighthouse. I don't want the company. I never did." "I know," Richard said, and something in his voice sounded almost surprised by his own certainty. "That's the strange part. You could have made this so much worse for me. You could have gone after the company itself, tried to unwind the whole founding structure, made a real mess of it in the press. My lawyers were braced for that. You didn't. I'm not you, Richard. I never wanted to burn the whole thing down. I wanted what was actually mine, and I wanted the truth to exist somewhere other than a locked drawer in Mother's dresser." She paused. "That's still all I want." He nodded slowly, looking down at the courthouse steps for a moment, and when he looked back up, something in his expression had shifted,
just slightly, into something that might have been the beginning of respect, or might just have been exhaustion. "The lighthouse," he said. "Are you keeping it?" "I am." $75, he said. And for the first time in longer than Eleanor could remember, there was something almost like a real laugh in it, small and disbelieving. $75 turned into $6 million. "It didn't turn into anything," Eleanor said. "The $6 million was always there, waiting for someone to go looking. The $75 just bought me the excuse to look." Richard didn't have a response to that. He stood there a moment longer, hands still in his coat pockets, and then he said, quieter than she'd heard him speak in years, "I'm glad it was you." "If it had to be anyone." He walked to his car without waiting for her answer, and Eleanor watched him go, understanding that this was likely as close to an apology as her brother had ever offered anyone in his life, and that it would have to be enough, because it was what she'd actually gotten, not what she'd hoped for. Daniel drove her back to Miller's Cove that afternoon, 6 hours north, mostly in comfortable silence, and by the time they crossed into Maine, the light was already going gold and low over the water, the way it did in late October, and Eleanor felt something in her chest that she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Not triumph exactly, something quieter than that. Something closer to arriving somewhere she'd been walking toward her entire life without knowing it. Winter came early to Widow's Point that year, the first frost settling over the gravel road in mid-November, and Eleanor Whitfield spent it exactly where she wanted to be, inside the keeper's cottage, a fire going in the newly repointed hearth, the strongbox that had started everything sitting on the mantel, where she could see it every morning when she woke. She used some of the money carefully, the way a woman does who spent most of her life without much of it. A new roof for the cottage, proper plumbing, a wood stove that actually drew right. She hired a contractor from Rockland to help her restore the lighthouse tower itself, not to working order. The automated buoy half a mile offshore still did that job, but to what it had once been. New glass in the lantern room. The old Fresnel lens which she found, astonishingly, still crated in a State Maritime Museum archive 50 miles south, on indefinite loan and largely forgotten. She got it back through Daniel's patient paperwork and a modest donation to the museum's restoration fund, and had it reinstalled that spring. She didn't light it for navigation. The Coast Guard wouldn't have allowed that, even if she'd wanted to, and the buoy did the real work now. But on clear nights, she'd climb the spiral stairs, 91 steps she'd counted more times than she could say, and switch on the lamp anyway, just to watch the old beam turn slow circles out over the water one more time, the way it had for the 8 years her grandfather kept this light, before a storm and a stranger's gratitude changed the whole shape of his life. Walter Pruitt started coming by most Sundays, bringing coffee and, eventually, just himself, the two of them sitting on the cottage porch, watching the harbour traffic come and go, not saying much, not needing to. Agnes Doyle visited too, cataloguing what remained of Eli's letters for the Historical Society's archive, with Eleanor's blessing, the two of them piecing together, letter by letter, the fuller shape of a man who'd spent his whole life keeping a promise nobody had asked him to keep, simply because he'd decided it mattered. Eleanor set up a modest fund, quietly, through Daniel's office, to help maintain 3 other decommissioned light stations along the Maine coast that had fallen into the same disrepair Widow's Point once had. Not as a gesture for anyone's benefit but her own, because she understood now, in a way she never had before, what it meant for a place like that to be saved by someone who simply refused to let it be forgotten. Richard called twice that winter. The first time was brief, almost businesslike, checking whether she wanted any involvement in updating the company's official history, a mention on the website, at minimum, of Cormorant Trust and its role in the company's founding capital. Eleanor told him to do what he thought was right, and left it entirely in his hands. When the updated history went up in January,
It included 2 paragraphs about Eli Whitfield's years as a lighthouse keeper and the rescue that had made everything after it possible. It didn't mention Eleanor by name. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't mind. The second call came in February, on a night when the wind was coming hard off the water and Eleanor had the wood stove going and a pot of tea on the stovetop. Richard sounded different, less careful, less like a man reciting lines he'd rehearsed. "Caroline asked me something the other day," he said. "She wanted to know why we never talk about you. Why she grew up thinking you were just Mother's difficult sister. She's 26, Eleanor. She doesn't remember why any of this started. None of us really do anymore, if I'm honest. It's just been the way things were for so long that nobody questioned it." Eleanor sat with that for a moment, watching the fire. "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth, that I don't fully know why either, that somewhere along the way I decided you were less than the rest of us, and I never once stopped to ask myself if that was fair, because it was easier not to." He paused. "I'm not asking you to forgive 30 years in one phone call. I know that's not how this works. But I'd like Caroline to know her actual great-grandfather, the one who rode out into a storm instead of the one on the wall of the lobby." "I'd like that too," Eleanor said, and meant it. They didn't fix everything that winter, and Eleanor didn't expect them to. Some things, she'd come to understand, took as long to rebuild as they'd taken to break, and 30 years of being made to feel like an afterthought didn't undo itself over a few phone calls and an updated paragraph on a company website. But something had shifted, quietly, the way tide shifts, not all at once, but steadily, in a direction that mattered. In March, Caroline drove up to Widow's Point on her own, without Richard, and stood at the base of the tower the way Eleanor once had, one hand on the cold stone. Eleanor made her tea and told her everything, start to finish, the storage unit, and the letters, and the auction, and the strongbox behind the hearth, and Caroline listened the way Agnes had, the way Daniel had, with the particular attention of someone finally hearing a story that had been missing from her own life, without her knowing it was gone. "He just went out in a rowboat," Caroline said finally, looking up at the lantern room. "In a storm, for strangers." "He did. That's not the story I grew up with," Caroline said. "The story I grew up with was about a tugboat and hard work and nothing else. This is so much better." Eleanor thought about that for a long time after Caroline left, standing on the porch as the girl's car disappeared down the gravel road. The same road Richard's Mercedes had come up 7 months earlier. The same road Eleanor herself had first walked with a key that hadn't turned a lock in 50 years. She thought about her mother, who'd kept a storage unit secret for 19 years and left it to the one child who'd actually go looking. She thought about Eli Whitfield, 27 years old and freezing in a February gale, rowing back out to a sinking ship, not for the gold, but because he'd already made a promise to himself about who he was going to be. She thought about $75, counted out in 5s and 10s, and what it had actually bought her. Not $6 million, not really, though that had certainly changed her life. It had bought her the truth. And more than that, it had brought her back to herself, to a version of Eleanor Whitfield that had been quietly waiting, all those years, for someone to finally go looking. She climbed the 91 steps to the lantern room that evening, the way she did most nights now, and switched on the old lamp, and watched the beam turn slow and steady over the dark water, the way it always had, the way it always would, for anyone out there who still needed a light to find their way home by. Spring came fully to Widow's Point in April, the gorse along the bluff greening up, the harbour traffic in Miller's Cove picking up again as the lobster boats went back to their summer routes, and Eleanor Whitfield found herself, on a Tuesday morning she'd remember for a long time afterward, standing at the kitchen table of the keeper's cottage, reading a letter that had nothing to do with trusts or gold coins
or 90-year-old shipwrecks.
It was from the Maine Lighthouse Preservation Society, a modest non-profit out of Rockland that maintained a handful of the state's decommissioned light stations as historic sites. They'd heard, through channels that inevitably ran through Agnes Doyle, about the restoration work at Widow's Point, and they wanted to know if Eleanor might be willing to open the tower to the public a few days a month, as a small historic site. Not a museum, nothing grand, just a way for people to walk up the gravel road, climb the 91 steps, and stand in the lantern room the way keepers once had. Eleanor thought about it for exactly one afternoon before she called them back and said yes. The first open day was the second Saturday in May, and she hadn't expected more than a handful of visitors, a few retirees interested in maritime history, maybe a family or two passing through on their way up the coast. Instead, word had gotten around Miller's Cove in the particular way small towns pass along a good story, and by 10 in the morning, there were nearly 40 people gathered at the base of the tower, Walter Pruitt among them, handing out coffee from a thermos the way he always seemed to be doing, and Agnes stationed at a folding table with a small display of Eli Whitfield's letters and the original Concordia rescue clipping, laminated now and mounted for viewing. Eleanor gave a short talk before she let people climb the tower, standing at the base where her grandfather had once posed for a photograph in his heavy wool coat, and told them the story the way she'd come to understand it herself, without embellishment, without the polish Richard's company had once put on it. A keeper who rode into a storm because it was what needed doing. A grateful man who tried to give away something meaningful, quietly, in a way that wouldn't cost his rescuer his dignity. A promise kept for 92 years by two men who never met each other but somehow understood each other completely. He didn't do it for the reward, she told the small crowd, the wind coming soft off the water behind her. I want to be clear about that. He'd already done the hard part before anyone offered him anything. The reward just happened to find him afterward, because that's sometimes how it works, when you do the right thing without checking first whether it'll pay off. Richard came up in June, alone, driving the same black Mercedes up the same gravel road, though this time he called ahead first, which Eleanor noted with some private satisfaction. He walked the grounds slowly, taking in the fresh paint, the restored lens throwing prisms of afternoon light across the lantern room walls, the small laminated display Agnes had put together near the cottage door. "It's good work," he said, and this time it didn't sound stiff at all. "I mean that. Thank you." He stood at the railing outside the lantern room for a while, looking out at the water, and Eleanor let the silence sit between them, no longer feeling the old need to fill it with something conciliatory. "I've been thinking about starting a scholarship," he said eventually, "through the company, for kids from fishing and coastal towns who want to go into maritime engineering, marine biology, that kind of thing. Name it after him, after both of them actually, Eli and Thomas Ashford. Two men who trusted each other with something that mattered, at a time when that kind of trust wasn't cheap." He glanced at her. "I wanted to ask you first, before I did anything with it." Eleanor considered that for a moment, surprised by how much it meant to her that he'd thought to ask at all. "I think he'd have liked that," she said. "Better than a paragraph on a website." "I'd like your input on it," Richard said, "if you'd be willing. Not because you have to be, because I think you'd actually get it right, and I'm not sure I would, on my own." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, not in so many words, but it was Richard Whitfield asking his sister for help, which was a sentence Eleanor never in her life expected to hear, and she found she didn't need the apology as much as she'd once thought she would. What she needed was this: being asked, being included, being treated like someone whose judgment actually mattered to the family that had spent 30 years suggesting otherwise. "I'd be glad to," she said. By the following spring, the Whitfield Ashford Maritime Scholarship had sent its first 3 students to State University marine programs, funded quietly, without much fanfare, exactly the way Eleanor suspected her grandfather would have preferred it. Caroline visited Widow's Point every few months by then,
sometimes bringing friends who wanted to see the lighthouse they'd heard about, sometimes just to sit on the porch with Eleanor and drink coffee and ask questions about a great-grandfather she was still, slowly, getting to know second-hand, through letters and an old photograph, and a story finally being told the way it actually happened. Eleanor kept the 11 gold coins in a small case on the cottage mantel, not because they were worth much on their own, but because they'd been the first proof, the first thread she'd pulled that unraveled everything else. Some evenings, when the light was going gold over the water and the wind had settled into the particular hush that came just before dusk on the Maine coast, she'd take them out and hold one in her palm, turning it over the way her grandfather must have, 90-some years earlier, sitting in this same cottage, deciding what kind of man he wanted to be with a stranger's gratitude. She thought, more often than she expected to, about the $75, about how close she'd come to not raising her hand at all, standing in that half-empty county auction room with $412 to her name and nothing left to lose, about how the whole shape of her life had turned, quietly and completely, on a single moment of deciding to bid on something everyone else in the room had already written off. The light still turned every clear evening, 91 steps up, the old lens throwing its slow beam out over water that had once nearly taken 4 men's lives, and had instead, through some strange and patient turning of fate, given Eleanor Whitfield her own life back. She had bought a lighthouse for $75. What she'd found inside it was never really about the money at all. It was about a promise kept long enough to outlast everyone who'd tried to forget it, and a woman finally willing to go looking for the truth nobody else in her family had bothered to ask about. That, she'd come to understand, standing at the lantern room railing on a clear evening with the whole coast spread out gold and quiet before her, was worth more than $6 million ever could be. The last week of September brought the first real cold snap of the season, and Eleanor woke before dawn to frost on the cottage windows and the particular stillness that settles over the Maine coast just before the light truly turns toward winter. She made coffee on the wood stove, wrapped herself in her late husband's old wool sweater, and climbed the 91 steps to watch the sun come up over water, the color of hammered pewter. It had been just over a year since the gavel came down in that cold county building. Eleanor had taken to marking the anniversary quietly, alone, standing in the lantern room at first light, though this year Agnes had insisted on driving out with a thermos of coffee and 2 cups, unwilling to let the day pass unmarked entirely. 1 year, Agnes said, handing her a cup, as they stood at the railing, breath fogging in the cold. Feels longer, somehow. In a good way. It does, Eleanor agreed. Below them, the keeper's cottage sat solid and repaired, smoke curling from its chimney. The Historical Society's small display case, visible through the front window, even from this height. Beyond it, the gravel road wound down toward the coastal highway. The same road Eleanor had first driven up in her tired sedan with $412 to her name. The same road Richard's Mercedes had climbed twice now. The second time without an argument waiting at the end of it. Daniel Reyes had become something more than a lawyer over the past year. A friend, really. The kind who drove up from Portland every few months just to sit on the porch and talk. No billable hours involved. He'd helped Eleanor set up a modest foundation that spring, the Eli Whitfield Coastal Heritage Fund, formalizing the work she'd already started informally. Small grants to help other towns along the Maine coast preserve their own decommissioned light stations, keepers' logs, maritime records that might otherwise moulder away in forgotten storage units, the way her grandfather's letters nearly had. You know, Daniel had said to her once, over coffee on the porch in August, most people who come into money like this spend it trying to feel like they've arrived somewhere. You spent yours trying to make sure other people's grandfathers don't get forgotten too. Eleanor hadn't quite known how to answer that at the time. She still didn't, entirely, except to say that she understood now, in a way she never had before her mother's funeral, how easily a life's real story could get quietly erased by people who found the truth inconvenient, and how much it mattered to have someone go looking before it was gone for good. Walter Pruitt had taken to calling the lighthouse Eleanor's Light around town, which she'd protested at first and eventually stopped fighting because it seemed to please him too much for her to argue about it. He'd become a fixture at the cottage most weeks, fixing things that didn't strictly need fixing, and Eleanor had stopped pretending she didn't look forward to Sunday mornings and the sound of his truck coming up the gravel road. Caroline had switched her graduate program that year, from corporate law, which she'd been pursuing mostly because it was expected of a Whitfield, to maritime heritage studies, a decision that had apparently caused some quiet consternation at her father's dinner table and considerable delight in Eleanor's cottage kitchen. She'd spent the summer as an informal apprentice to Agnes at the Historical Society, cataloguing the last of Eli Whitfield's letters, cross-referencing them against Ashford Shipping's surviving corporate records, slowly building what she called, with the particular earnestness of someone who'd just discovered a life's calling, the real history nobody bothered writing down. Richard visited in October, this time bringing Caroline with him, and the three of them stood together at the base of the tower on a bright, cold afternoon, while a small group of visitors from a bus tour out of Camden climbed the spiral stairs above them, murmuring about the view. "The scholarship's grown," Richard said, watching the tourists. 6 students now, not 3. A university in Bar Harbor wants to set up a permanent partnership. Name a research fellowship after him too. He'd have hated all the attention, Eleanor said, smiling slightly. He kept this quiet for 90 years for a reason. Maybe, Richard said, but I think he'd have liked what it's actually doing. Kids from towns like this one, getting a chance they wouldn't otherwise have had. He paused, looking up at the tower, the fresh white paint catching the autumn light. I used to think the company was the whole story. The tugboat, the growth, the numbers on a quarterly report. I don't think that anymore. I think the company was just one small piece of what he actually built, and honestly the least interesting piece, once you know the rest of it. It was, Eleanor thought, as close as her brother had ever come to fully understanding what she'd found in that storage unit, and she let the moment sit without pushing it further, the way she'd learned to do over the past year. Trusting that some things arrived in their own time, the way the trust itself had waited 92 years for someone willing to go looking. That evening, after Richard and Caroline had driven back toward the highway, Eleanor climbed the tower alone, the way she did most evenings, and switched on the restored lamp, watching the beam sweep its slow, patient circle out over darkening water. She thought about her grandfather at 27, freezing in a February storm, making a decision in the space of a few desperate minutes that would ripple forward across nearly a century, shaping the lives of people who wouldn't be born for decades. She thought about her mother, quietly paying storage fees for 19 years, leaving behind a folder and a key instead of an explanation, trusting that the right person would eventually come looking, even if she couldn't say so herself before she died. She thought about $75 and the particular specific courage it had taken to raise her hand in that half-empty county building when she had almost nothing left to lose and every reason to believe nothing good was coming. The light kept turning. Below her, the cottage windows glowed warm against the coming dark, smoke rising steady from the chimney, and somewhere out past the breakwater, the automated buoy blinked its own small, steady rhythm, doing the work the old lamp no longer needed to do, but which Eleanor kept lighting anyway, every clear evening, because some things deserved to be kept alive even after their practical purpose had passed. She was 59 years old, standing alone in a lighthouse she'd bought with everything she had left in the world, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor Whitfield understood exactly who she was, and exactly what she'd built, and she understood that no one, not Richard, not the family, not 30 years of being treated as an afterthought, could ever again take that away from her.
The light kept turning, steady and sure, out over the dark water, the way it always had, the way it always would. The letter arrived in November, forwarded through Daniel's office, because whoever had sent it hadn't known where else to send it. Just Eleanor Whitfield, care of the attorney who handled the Cormorant Trust filing, Suffolk County Probate Court, scrawled across the top in handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone unused to writing letters at all. Daniel called before he mailed it up to her. "You'll want to sit down for this one," he said, which was so unlike him that Eleanor actually did sit down, right there at the kitchen table, the wood stove ticking as it cooled from the morning fire. The letter was from a man named Peter Ashford, 61 years old, living outside Providence, Rhode Island. He explained, in the careful, slightly formal handwriting of someone who'd clearly drafted the letter more than once, that he was the great-grandson of Thomas Ashford, and that he'd read a small item in a Boston maritime history newsletter about a dormant trust finally being claimed by the heirs of a lighthouse keeper named Eli Whitfield. He hadn't known his own family's history in any detail. Ashford Shipping had folded in the late 1940s, another casualty of a changing industry, and what remained of the family's records had scattered across 3 generations of moves, divorces, and a house fire in the 1970s that had taken most of what was left. Peter had grown up knowing only the barest outline, that his great-grandfather had survived a shipwreck once, that the family had been wealthy and then wasn't, and little else. Reading about Cormorant Trust, he wrote, was the first time in his life he'd learned any real detail about who Thomas Ashford actually was. He asked, tentatively, almost apologetically, whether Eleanor might be willing to meet. Not for any claim on the trust. He was careful to say twice that he wanted nothing of the kind, that the assets were rightfully hers under the very agreement his own great-grandfather had signed. He simply wanted to know more. About Eli, about the storm, about a grandfather he'd never really had the chance to know. Eleanor wrote back within the week, and by the second week of December, Peter Ashford was standing at the base of Widow's Point Light on a bright, cold Saturday morning, a heavy-set man with his great-grandfather's same dark eyes, if the old newspaper photograph Agnes had was anything to go by, looking up at the tower the way people did when they were trying to place themselves inside a story they'd only just learned belonged to them. He'd brought a box of his own. Not gold, nothing like that, but photographs, a handful of Thomas Ashford's personal letters that had survived the house fire because his grandmother had kept them in a safe deposit box instead of at home, and a small leather diary, water-stained but legible, that Thomas had kept during his years running Ashford Shipping. Eleanor and Peter sat at the cottage table for most of that afternoon, trading pieces of 2 men's lives back and forth across 90 years, and somewhere in the middle of it, Peter found the entry he'd apparently been looking for the whole drive up, the one he'd flagged with a torn strip of paper. February 19th, 1932. Written 3 days after the Concordia went down. I am alive because a man I had never met chose to row into the worst storm I have ever seen, for no reason I can find, except that it was the right thing to do, and he could not live with himself otherwise. I have tried to think what I might offer him that would not insult a man like that, and I confess I do not entirely know. Money seems both too much and not enough. I have decided, at least, to try. Eleanor read it twice, her throat tight, and then read it a third time aloud, because Peter asked her to, his voice unsteady by the time she finished. "He never told anyone," Peter said. "Not really. There's a line in one of the later letters, years after, where he mentions the arrangement at the light to his own son, my grandfather, but nothing more than that. I don't think anyone in my family knew what it actually meant. I don't think anyone thought to ask, same as mine," Eleanor said. "My grandfather left it in a locked drawer. My mother left it in a storage unit. 2 families, both just quietly sitting on the same secret for 90 years, neither one of us talking to the other." Peter looked around the cottage, the mended window,
the restored hearth, the small display case Agnes had put together near the door, and something in his face settled, the particular relief of a person who'd come looking for a fragment and found something closer to whole. "I'd like to help if I can," he said, "with the Heritage Fund or the scholarship your brother started. It seems wrong for this to just be your family's story now, when it was always both of ours." Eleanor thought about that for a long moment, watching the afternoon light move across the table between them. Two men's handwriting spread out side by side after 9 decades of silence. "I'd like that," she said. "I think that's exactly what he'd have wanted. Both of them, actually." By spring, the Whitfield-Ashford Coastal Heritage Fund had its first joint board meeting. Peter Ashford and Caroline Whitfield sitting across from each other at Daniel's office in Portland. Two great-grandchildren of men who'd never expected their quiet arrangement to outlive either of them by a century, now building something neither of their families had managed to build on their own, a shared, honest accounting of where they'd actually come from. Eleanor stood at the lantern room railing that April, watching a fishing boat make its way out past the breakwater in the pale early light, and thought about how strange it was, the way a single decision made in a storm could keep unfolding outward for generations, touching lives that hadn't existed yet, connecting families that had never met, all because one man had decided, in the coldest minutes of his life, that some things mattered more than the risk of losing everything to get them. She thought about the $75 again, the way she often did now, not with the disbelief of that first year, but with something quieter, a kind of gratitude that had settled into her the way the tide settled against the rocks below the tower, steady, patient, arriving again and again, whether anyone was there to notice or not. The light kept turning behind her, out over water that had taken so much from both families once, and given back, in the end, so much more than either of them had thought to hope for. Summer arrived at Widow's Point with the particular fullness it always brought to the Maine coast. The gorse gone to seed along the bluff, the harbour in Miller's Cove thick with tourists and lobster boats both. And Eleanor Whitfield found herself busier than she had been in the 2 years since she'd first climbed that ladder to fix a rain gutter with $75 and a stubborn kind of hope to her name. The Heritage Fund had grown faster than any of them expected. What had started as Eleanor quietly helping 1 or 2 other towns preserve their own decommissioned light stations had become, by that June, a modest but genuine regional effort. 6 lighthouses along the Maine coast, now under some form of restoration, a partnership with the university in Bar Harbor formalized into an actual maritime studies program, and a rotating exhibit, co-curated by Agnes and Caroline, that had begun traveling to historical societies up and down the coastline, telling the story of a keeper and a captain and a promise that had outlasted both of them. Peter Ashford came up most months now, sometimes with his own 2 grown children, who'd taken to the story with the same hungry curiosity their father had shown that first December afternoon. His daughter, a marine biologist finishing her doctorate, had started working informally with Caroline on a research component tied to the fund, documenting the ecological history of the coastline alongside its maritime one. The 2 young women falling into an easy friendship built on 2 families' shared history and, increasingly, very little to do with it at all. Richard visited more than Eleanor would once have believed possible, though never quite as often as Caroline, who'd taken to spending long stretches of her summer at Widow's Point, sleeping in the cottage's small second room Eleanor had finally finished renovating, working alongside Agnes most mornings, and swimming off the rocks below the lighthouse most evenings, the way Eleanor imagined a great-granddaughter of Eli Whitfield's ought to. It was Caroline who suggested, that July, that they hold some kind of gathering, not a formal ceremony, nothing stiff, just a way of marking what the 2 families had built together in the 18 months since Peter Ashford's letter had arrived. Eleanor resisted the idea at first, uncomfortable as always with anything that put her at the center of attention, but Agnes and Walter, and eventually even Daniel, weighed in on Caroline's side, until Eleanor finally relented, on the condition that it stay small, and stay at the lighthouse, and stay entirely unfussy. It was neither small nor entirely unfussy, in the end, though Eleanor found she didn't mind nearly as much as she'd expected to.
60 people gathered on the bluff on a clear evening in late July. Miller's Cove locals who'd watched the restoration happen a season at a time, the 6 scholarship students and their families, Peter Ashford's whole extended family driven up from Rhode Island, Richard and his wife Caroline, Daniel, Walter with a folding table of coffee he refused to let anyone else manage. Eleanor gave a short speech at dusk, standing at the base of the tower the way she had at that first open day 2 summers earlier. Though the words came easier now, worn smooth by 2 years of telling this story to strangers and coming to understand it better herself each time. "I used to think this was a story about money," she said, the crowd quiet around her, the light starting to go gold and long across the water behind them. About a fortune nobody knew was there, waiting to be found. I don't think that anymore. I think it was always a story about 2 men who trusted each other completely, at the worst possible moment either of them ever faced, and about what happens when that kind of trust is allowed to keep growing, quietly, for as long as it needs to. She glanced at Peter, standing near the front with his daughter, and at Caroline just beside them. I think it's also a story about what happens when the people who come after finally decide to ask the questions nobody thought to ask before. My mother kept a secret for 19 years because she didn't know what else to do with it. I only found the truth because I finally had nothing left to lose by looking. I'd like to think that from here on, none of us need to wait until we've got nothing left before we start asking. As the light faded, Eleanor climbed the tower one more time, this time with Caroline and Peter's daughter, both following her up the 91 steps, the 3 of them crowding into the small lantern room together, and Eleanor switched on the old lamp and let the beam begin its slow turn out over the darkening water, while the party continued below, laughter and conversation drifting up faint on the evening air. "Do you ever think about what would have happened?" Caroline asked, watching the light sweep its circle. "If you hadn't gone to that auction? If you'd just let it go, taken the folder, and gone home?" Eleanor considered the question the way she often did now, with less anxiety than she might have felt asking it of herself 2 years earlier. "I think about it," she said, "but I don't think I could have let it go. Honestly, not after reading his letters. There's something in you that knows when a thing needs finishing, even if you can't say exactly why yet. I just happened to be standing in the right auction room, with just enough left in my pocket to raise my hand." Below them, the party had spilled down toward the rocks. Someone had started a small fire in the pit Walter had built that spring, and the whole scene, 60 people from 2 families that had never known each other a year and a half earlier, gathered now on a bluff their grandfathers had shared without either of them realizing it. Struck Eleanor, standing in the lantern room with the beam turning steady above her, as the truest thing the $75 had ever actually bought. Not the money, not even the truth exactly, though that had mattered enormously. This, people, gathered, remembering someone properly, together, the way he should have been remembered all along. The light kept turning, out over the dark water, patient as it had always been, and Eleanor Whitfield stood in it, finally, entirely, home.